Hey guys, welcome to Revival Cycles Tech Talk. I'm Stefan, and in this episode we are talking about the Motoscope Mini from MotoGadget. Alright, so we're talking about the Motoscope Mini. Now, the Motoscope Mini is the smallest of the digital gauges from MotoGadget. There's two digital gauges basically. There's the Motoscope Pro, which is kind of like the granddaddy with the most features and the most stuff, but it's also the biggest and it may not be appropriate for your project. And this is the Mini. This is the smaller of the LCD gauges, not to be confused with the analog ones like the Chrono Classic and the Motoscope Tiny, which are the needle sweep, more traditional style gauges. This is the case where less is more. So this gauge has fewer features than the Motoscope Pro, but it's also a lot smaller, easier to hide, much more subtle, but it still has the information that you need. So this has the tachometer, speedometer, odometer, tripometer, and that's pretty much it. There is a timer that you can kind of track your elapsed riding time, but I guess for me, I've never really found much value in that, so I think that's just one of those things that was easy for them to add, and they could add one feature to the set, but who really cares because you're never ever going to use that. So, on to this. The rest of this package is a lot like the other MotoGadget products, really well built. You can feel it's got a nice weight to it. This is not some cheap thing that you had imported from China. This was made by people that really gave a shit about what they were doing. So, aluminum housing, crystal clear glass, really nice mounting holes in the back, a very small, discrete wire that then holds all the various conductors that give the information that the gauge needs from the bike. Great piece, but what else comes in the bag? We get a speed sensor, and I'll use that term loosely. This is really a dry contact magnetic reed switch that is used as a speed sensor, and if you've got a vintage bike, this type of a gauge doesn't have any way to interface with the old rotating cable style speedos, so we need to have a way to tell this gauge what this vehicle speed is. It's done by using this reed contact switch, which works by passing a magnet near the switch that causes the two contacts in here to close, and that sends a signal to the gauge letting it know that the wheel has made one revolution. Now we need a magnet in order to make that switch work, and conveniently MotoGadget has included that for us. Of course, being a magnet, it likes to stick to all the other metal stuff in this bag, so getting one out to show you is a little tricky. But here we go. So this is actually two of the magnets, and the way that these are installed is basically drilling a hole in the head of a bolt or in the face of a rotor or pretty much anywhere where you would want this magnet to live. Just make a small hole and then you can epoxy or super glue or use some other adhesive of your choice to hold it in place so that it passes near your reed switch. That sends a signal to the gauge. So we've got magnets. The next thing in the bag of mounting hardware is a bunch of these crimp connectors. Now, I hate these things. These are really just asking for trouble down the road. If you make a basic crimp connection like this, it'll work for a while, but with these very small gauge wires, there really aren't that many strands that need to break before the whole thing comes disconnected. And I would suggest throwing these in the trash and then finding a proper connector or doing a solder and heat shrink type of installation. There's a great video that we did on heat shrink that covers a few of the techniques for soldering and heat shrinking. You can check that out at revivalcycles.com or on our YouTube channel. Next up, we get a little push button. This is just included for your convenience in case you don't have a spare switch on the switch gear on your handlebars. You can add this to the bars or somewhere else on the bike, and you use this switch to cycle through the various features on the gauge and also to configure and calibrate the gauge. So you will want to have the ability to reset your tripometer or to cycle through so you can read the RPM as a digital readout, but it's really up to you. If you've got room and a spare contact in the handlebar switches you've already got, use those. Otherwise, add this guy in. It's worth noting, this type of switch is a solder contact, so you will need to be able to solder wires to the back of it in order to install it. And lastly, we get a couple of screws and a couple of washers. These screws match the holes in the back of the gauge, makes it a little bit easier to mount, and you don't have to go fishing around for some M3 screws. That is what comes in the mounting kit. There's one last important piece to note in the mounting, and that is you need to use a fuse to protect these very small wires from the unfortunate event of a short circuit. So they've included this convenient little fuse holder, and this is set up so that you can crimp these little end terminals inside of this housing, and that way you don't have to do a splice on the wire. You can actually just crimp it directly, and this is a really convenient fuse holder for a low amp application. But maybe you've got another fuse holder that you like, that's fine. Just make sure you've got a fuse somewhere between 1 and maybe up to 3 amps at the most. All right, so the details of this, we've got 5 wires on this gauge. They're pretty straightforward, and the easy one to pick out almost every single time is the black wire, that's ground. The next one, also pretty obvious, that's red wire, it's power input. Make sure that one goes to the fuse. After that, we get yellow, and that is for the tachometer input. There's a little bit of a caveat that I'm going to talk about at the end, but just know that the yellow wire is for the tachometer input. Next, white wire is for the speedometer input, and lastly, the green wire is for the configuration button. That's how you set up the calibrations and also how you cycle through the different features of the gauge. All right, that yellow wire about the tachometer input, this gets connected to the ground side of the ignition coil, and on 90% of the bikes out there, that's exactly the way it goes. It's just that simple. There are a few cases where you're running a true CDI system, even though the vocabulary, sometimes CDI gets bounced around for anything that has the magic box that controls the ignition. CDI really means capacitive discharge ignition, and that is where it's self-generating its own power, and the voltages in the ignition system are actually higher. Those are not compatible with this gauge, and you would need to use an isolation sensor, which is also available at revivalcycles.com. If you have questions about your ignition system, or you have reason to suspect you have a CDI and want to make sure, send us an email at techsupport@revivalcycles. If you include a wire diagram with that email, I can actually take a look at it and tell you what type of ignition system you have. And that's pretty much it for the Motoscope Mini. This is a really discreet and convenient little gauge that's just jam-packed with the information you need and nothing you don't. It keeps it simple, you don't have to be confused, it's easy to install, it's easy to configure, and honestly, this is one of my favorite gauges for the digital set. I like that it is easy to hide on the bike and it doesn't take up that much space in the cockpit. So, this product and a whole lot of other great products are available at revivalcycles.com. Check it out. That's how you guys can support us so we can make more of these videos for you. By buying from us, you know that you're supporting a builder that actually uses the products that they sell, and we can therefore give you excellent technical support and make sure that you can answer any question that you have on your application. Thanks for watching, guys.